We're now going to discuss the Civil War. And when I say this, we're not actually going to discuss military history. That is to say, the various battles that were fought, nor are we really going to discuss the legacies of the Civil War. Now, that's not to say it's less important than what I'm about to discuss. And for that information, again, which is important, please refer to the textbook, which does a decent job in delineating that history. But what we're going to discuss is, as indicated in the slide, the meaning of the Civil War, actually the meanings, plural, of the Civil War. And if you look at the subtitle, How Human Interpretation of Events Shape the Future, we're going to see how, people's interpretation of events actually shape, the future, right? Future history, if you will. The unfolding of history itself. So this broaches an interesting idea here, interesting notion that's applicable to the Civil War and also to Reconstruction. Now, Reconstruction is the period that follows the Civil War when, as the name suggests, the attempt there is to reconstruct the South and really the whole nation from the ashes of destruction wrought by this terrible Civil War. But, and by the way, it also applies to countless other events, not just Civil War. But again, we're posing the question, or this idea actually, that human interpretations, that's to say the meanings that we affix or put upon the past and current events, they go on to shape future events, and therefore they shape history. Okay, so the way that people affix meaning to certain events, again, in the past and the present, matters a lot. And it matters so much to the point where, it actually shapes the future. And by the way, what do we mean by meaning? Well, I really mean this, to use that word, in the everyday sense, right? It includes value judgments, right? What academics call, evaluative judgments, right? Meaning, what's good or what's bad, right? Or to use a quasi-religious term, what's evil, okay? For example, let's think about World War II and the Nazi Holocaust, where 6 million Jews perished. Well, we could say that was bad, right? Unless you're a Nazi who feels that's good, we almost unanimously say that was bad. In fact, we even could use the word evil, even if we're not religious, right? That was evil, right? And it should be obvious to you that these normative judgments, what I call evaluative judgments, right? You could do this in like a history course or a philosophy course or a literature course, right? The humanities, not really in the sciences. You don't come up with those types of judgments like, in physics, right? Or in mathematics, right? You don't say E equals MC squared is bad or evil, right? But when we're talking about human events, certainly you could ascribe those evaluative judgments, okay? Now, there is usually an array of meanings put forth by different people, different groups. And sometimes, or oftentimes, they are at odds with each other, okay? Think of current events today. Well, there's different interpretations, different meanings to what's happening as these events unfold. This goes all the way back to the beginning of our nation's history, U.S. history. Let's say the American Revolution. Well, there's the American point of view, the fight against, a tyrannical King George suppressing colonial rights. But, of course, there's the meaning of the war from the British point of view. Their interpretation is that the colonials are disobeying English law, and if they're English subjects, they they must be disciplined, right? They're destroying property, they're rioting, they're trespassing their rights as British. Okay, so you could see how, or we could see how or what this means, right, when we talk about meaning and interpretation. Now, hopefully you've read the Stephen Hahn article, right? And of course, the article is titled, What Lincoln Meant to the Slaves, and underscore meant, right? So this is going to dovetail seamlessly with that article. Okay, in fact, I asked you to read it before engaging with this lecture that you're listening to. But again, with the Civil War, and Stephen Hahn reminds us the slave's point of view, right? There's an array of interpretations of the conflict that is unfolding before them. Which side, which interpretation, which meaning is going to shape the future? The slave's perspective, Lincoln's perspective, the Southern perspective, right? Okay, so this may seem a bit abstract, admittedly, right? And we'll concretize this very soon as we engage with this lecture. Now, we're talking about what the Civil War meant to different groups of people as it broke out. And also the way these meanings changed as the war unfolded and progressed. And we'll also connect these interpretations to post-war events, namely Reconstruction, as I discussed earlier. Okay, now, if you're familiar with the war, the Civil War, and by the way, if you're not, please read the textbook. But hopefully that this is a sectional conflict. This is something we discussed earlier, sectionalism. Sectionalism refers to political division that's based upon geography, more so than, let's say, political ideology. So, what we have here is the northern states pitted against the southern states. Now, the Union North, if you look at their economic geography as indicated on the slide, well, they practice a form of industrial labor. Okay, they were already beginning the Industrial Revolution in 1861 when the war broke out. And what labor was utilized in this political economy? It's what's called free wage labor. Okay, now the term free refers to the fact that, you're not a slave, right? And then wage, well, that's the way laborers were compensated for their labor, is through wages. And this is something that's new in the 19th century. Okay, so even though it's commonplace today, we don't even question it. This is a new system that's replacing, let's say, slavery, or being a peasant farmer in an agrarian setting. So this is what characterizes the North in terms of economic geography. What about the South? Well, it's certainly and profoundly agrarian. Right, and that doesn't surprise us because it's plantations, right? That's the main economic modality, if you will. The southern plantation economy. What type of labor? Well, we know they are utilizing unfree as opposed to free wage labor, unfree or slave labor. So these are the two types of political economies that were around the eve of the Civil War, 1861. And it's important to note this, both types, the industrial North, their economy, and also the agrarian South and the plantation economy, both are expansionist. Okay, they want to expand geographically. Why? Well, let's think about the South. As we discussed, cotton. Cotton is the primary export commodity, and indeed, by the 1830s, almost half of the entire country's, not just the South, but the entire nation's GDP was derived from cotton exports. Okay, so that's stunning when you think about it. And here's another even more stunning fact, that, okay, who's responsible for the labor? Well, it's the slaves in the South, African-American slaves. At that point, there were about 6% of the entire population. Okay, so 6% of the population at that time was responsible for half of the country's GDP. Right, African-American slaves responsible for the economy. Okay, but the North wants to expand too because they're driven by profit as well. Okay, so you can imagine this as an eventual clash in purely structural terms, right? Economic terms. If they are both expansionist in this finite area called the United States, well, they're bound to collide if they are both expanding geographically, right? Now, as discussed, the United States gained immense territory by the late 1840s, in fact, right, after the U.S.-Mexico War. And this led to the sexual conflict of, hey, should this new territory that included, parts of California, or a lot of California, not to mention Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and so on, Colorado, should all this area be free and therefore more commercial or industrial, or should it be slave soil and be more, plantation labor? So that's a big issue that actually becomes political, right? It's economic and political. So, this conflict, the sexual conflict, reached a peak. And by 1861, just a few decades after the U.S.-Mexico War, we see the Civil War erupt, the most devastating war in U.S. history by far. Okay, you had 620,000 lives lost in the battlefield, not to mention civilian loss of life. Yet at the same time, it was a transformative event in U.S. history. Okay, as the nation emerged from, destruction, it transformed profoundly. Probably the most important change, of course, was the end of slavery. And the problem of what to do with nearly 4 million free slaves fell on the shoulders of the federal government. And that's what we'll discuss with Reconstruction, the next topic. But also what happened is, and speaking of the federal government becomes enlarged, okay, as a result of the war. Now, previous to the war, a lot of governance was based more on, if you will, state-based localism. That is, local state governments. Okay. And this kept the federal government smaller, right? But once you eliminate those barriers with the Civil War, the federal government supersedes in many ways, not entirely, of course, but in many ways, it supersedes state governments in power. And we know that today. We think of the federal government as, eclipsing state governments. So in basic terms, the U.S. enters modernity, especially with the end of slavery. What follows is the nation becoming more modern, as I mentioned, industrialization, westward expansion of Americans migrating from east to west. But you also see immigrants coming in at the same time, another form of migration. Technological innovation, business innovation, and so forth. So the new nation was forged here.